Okay, so when we last left off, we had looked at America's economy shifting over towards producing for a war. And we also looked at the difficulties America faced in creating a military and how the various groups in our population served or contributed. So now let's look at the actual combat or fighting of the war. Now, the first thing I have to do is give a couple of disclaimers or explanations. First of all, we are going to go through this a little faster or briefer than some people might expect. Every year, I have students that are surprised that I get through the entire Second World War in about a week. The Second World War is obviously a monumental event in human history and on our nation's history, but this is not West Point. And I am not interested in if you know all of the ins and outs about all of these battles and if you understand all the tactics and whatnot. I could throw hundreds of maps up there and we could sit there and break it down. But we aren't actually trying to teach you how to lead men into battle. Not to mention some of the things they did in World War II, we just don't do anymore. So yeah, people at West Point, people at military academies, they do study the ins and outs because they're trying to learn the actual lessons of combat. What I want us to learn is the significance of the battles. Why are they important? What did they do in the greater picture, in the greater scheme? I'm not as interested in the, what I like to call sports center highlights of World War II, where it's, oh, let's look at this, big hit. Oh, let's look at this big play. So it's going to go by a little briefer and faster than I think some people expect. But like we've done with most of the wars we've covered in our class, the lead up to the war and the causes of the war and the after effects of the war are oftentimes more important than the actual war. Another thing I have to explain is we will, like we did in the Civil War, we will kind of jump back and forth. But we will stick with one for a while. We will do the Pacific for a while, and then we'll go to Europe for a little while. And then we'll go back to the Pacific for a while, just like we did when we covered the Civil War, where we did the East for a while, the West for a while. There's no continuity otherwise. There were battles taking place simultaneously in both parts of the world, involving an entirely different cast of characters. And it would get very confusing, and there'd be no continuity and flow. So in order to provide some sort of story or narrative we can follow, what we'll do is we will do the Pacific first, for a little while. We'll jump to Europe, and we'll kind of keep doing that throughout. All that being said, let's go ahead and get started. When looking at the Pacific and Japan, the Japanese never intended to conquer or actually completely defeat the United States of America. It wasn't really a possibility. No matter how well the war went for them, realistically speaking, it wasn't physically a thing that they could have accomplished, and they knew that. And it's not something that they wanted to do, really. The Japanese were interested in just conquering China and their neighborhood in the Pacific and creating an empire there. They were not necessarily interested in taking parts of the United States. They didn't want to have to deal with having American citizens in an empire of theirs or anything of that nature. So they were not looking to actually conquer, Hawaii, the West Coast, anything of that sort. What they were looking for was to basically force the United States to accept Japanese power, or what we would call hegemony, over the Western Pacific. And so their strategy was to first attack Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was intended to be a knockdown punch, a cheap shot. It was designed to knock us to the floor, so to speak, using just a fight metaphor, right? They're going to sneak up on us and break a bottle over our head and knock us to the floor. And while we're struggling to get to our feet and shake the cobwebs off and get ready to fight back, their plan was to conquer all of the stuff in the Pacific that they needed. The islands that were home to all the oil and the other resources that they were desperately in need of. And with that secure, they would be able to build up their defenses. They would be able to build up their military to defend the territory that they had gained. And they expected an American counterattack. They expected America to get up, to rebuild our fleet, etc., and to come looking for revenge. Their plan was to sometimes stopped the American advances, and even in places where they had to give ground to make it a very bloody and costly fight. They assumed that America did not have the stomach or the will to take the humongous casualties that it would take to conquer back the Japanese Empire. Um, they were a lot of Japanese commanders. They knew about America. Matter of fact, Admiral Yamamoto, the man who planned the attack on Pearl Harbor, had spent time studying in California when he was in university. He had lived in this country amongst Americans, and he was fully aware that we were a peace-loving country and a peace-loving people. We are not a militaristic society. We tend to try to like to avoid war. We always have had a volunteer military, basically. We are not samurai. That is not our culture. And so he knew that. But unfortunately, too many of his comrades in the high command in the government, they took it a little too far, and they never assumed America would ever commit itself to a long-term conflict like the one World War II is going to be. He understood it, but a lot of his fellow generals and admirals, they assumed America, we would come at them, we would take a few bloody battles, and then we would say, you know what, it's not worth it. You can have everything, let's say, west of Hawaii. And that would be the end of it. Now, part of this requires you conquering the Philippines. You might remember we got the Philippines from the Spanish at the end of the Spanish-American War in 1898. It had become an American colony. It is American territory. We have large military bases there. We have Air Force bases, Army bases, naval bases. And so if you're the Japanese and your plan is to conquer the Western Pacific, one of the first things you have to do is take out the Americans in the Philippines. It's not enough to destroy the American fleet at Hawaii. You've got to prevent America from being able to use this as a base from which to target the rest of the Japanese empire that they were trying to build. Okay? And so the very day that Pearl Harbor was attacked, Japanese planes from Taiwan and elsewhere began bombing American positions in the Philippines. We knew the Philippines were going to be targeted, which is why we had sent General MacArthur there to try and beef up the defenses months before. But now they're alone. There's no reinforcements coming. The American fleet had been crippled at Pearl Harbor. There was no way to get reinforcements through all of this territory that the Japanese had since taken control of. Or at least, they had a fleet that overwhelmed ours. And so the American forces in the Philippines are fighting a war they're going to lose. They know they're going to lose. MacArthur knows they're going to lose. But he also knows that every day he stops the Japanese from conquering the Philippines, he slows them down and gives the American military time to rebuild. He's fighting what we would call a delaying action. He's fighting to try and give America as much time as possible so she can get ready and come back at the Japanese later on. Now, it became clear that the Philippines were going to fall very, very shortly, and the president ordered General MacArthur to evacuate. He told General MacArthur, you cannot be captured with your men. We cannot have it broadcast around the world by the Japanese that they captured the highest ranking general in the American army. That would be horrible for American morale. It would be, humiliating and embarrassing. MacArthur did not want to do it. He did not want to leave his men behind. He thought that was cowardly. I realized I forgot the A in MacArthur. I apologize. But he was ordered by his president, and so one night he boarded some, basically what are basically the military's equivalent of some speedboats, torpedo boats, and he fled southward to Australia. When he got to Australia, he gave a radio broadcast. He sent it back towards the Philippines and of course, to the rest of the world. He famously said, "I came through and I shall return," promising his men, letting them know he had successfully escaped and that he was going to come back and get them someday. It's just going to take a number of years to do so. Eventually, the American forces surrendered on April 9th, as you can see there. 78,000 soldiers surrendered. Actually, a large number of them were Filipinos. Many of the people fighting in the Philippines were in fact Filipinos defending their home. There were thousands of American prisoners as well, but of the 78,000, a good number of them were in fact Filipino natives. And once they were taken prisoner, they were then forced on what was the first of a number of war crimes committed by the Japanese against Americans, the famed Bataan Death March. The last spot that the Americans held on to is this little spot called the Bataan Peninsula. Okay? And basically, this is where they were when they surrendered. And so after they surrendered on Bataan Peninsula, they were forced to march off the Bataan Peninsula to prison camps. Some of these were as far as 65 miles away. You're going to force men who are malnourished. Many of them are suffering from illnesses of various tropical diseases. Some of them have, in fact, been wounded. They are in no shape for this. And you are going to make them march 65 miles through rugged terrain, some of it jungle, in jungle conditions, boiling heat, high humidity, etc. Thousands died along the way. And if you fell and could not get back up, you were simply shot or bayoneted right there along the trail in front of other prisoners. We don't know the exact number, but we do know that thousands of prisoners of war died on this march. There were a handful of American troops on a small island in Manila Bay known as Corregidor. They surrendered about a month after everybody else had. They held out until May of 1942 when they were finally forced to surrender because of a lack of food, and the Philippines were gone at that point. Talking about the Bataan Death March, this very quickly became the sort of stuff that galvanized or motivated the American public to fight a war of revenge that, again, the Japanese did not anticipate we had the stomach for. When Americans found out what had happened to our boys after their surrender and the atrocities that were committed, Americans became determined to fight this one to the end. And this is the sort of stuff that produced propaganda. It was ready-made for propaganda. This is an example of a propaganda poster made by the United States Army shortly after the tragedy at Bataan. As you can see, the supposed, headline taken out of a newspaper talking about how prisoners had been killed. You can see the imagery. Yes, a common slur back then against the Japanese was simply to call them a Jap. Another one that you might see if you ever watch movies, another one was nip. Those were both slang terms that were derogatory towards the Japanese. But you'll notice we weren't hesitating back then to throw that into a propaganda poster that would be out there for everyone to see. And as you can see, stay on the job until every murdering Jap is wiped out. America had committed herself to fighting to the bitter end. Now, in these dark days when the American fleet had been sneak attacked at Pearl Harbor and the Philippines are in danger of being captured, Franklin Roosevelt desperately needed something. He needed to give the Americans something to be excited about, happy about, proud about, something to boost morale. Now, obviously, an attack against the Japanese would be a great thing to do, but the problem is, by this point, America had nothing in the neighborhood of Japan to allow us to hit anything Japanese. We did have our aircraft carriers. Again, those had been fortuitously not present at Pearl Harbor when it was attacked, but carrier airplanes are small. They have to be to fly and land and operate on a carrier, which means they have limited range because they only carry so much fuel. And that would mean that America would have to get her carriers awfully close to the enemy in order to launch an attack on Japan. And Roosevelt understood we could not risk losing our aircraft carriers. They were far too valuable. They were literally the only thing saving us from a Japanese attack on Hawaii. And so he was trying to come up with an answer, and somebody eventually came to him with what was going to be one of the most amazing stunts, I'll call it, of World War II. Jimmy Doolittle, a lieutenant colonel, was put in command of a one-way bombing mission. The plan was to take B-25 medium bombers for the Army Air Corps, which was the name for the Air Force back then. These are planes that are not designed to take off from an aircraft carrier. They have no way of landing on an aircraft carrier. The plan was to take these planes, strip them of everything that was not vital, give them as much extra gas as you could, fly them off of an aircraft carrier deck, which again, they weren't designed to do, fly them to Japan, drop a few bombs on Tokyo, and since they couldn't land on the carrier, to keep flying westward and to land in China, and hopefully they would be rescued by Chinese fighters when they landed. This is a crazy idea. Some people assumed it was going to be a suicide mission. Turns out, of the 80 men involved in this mission, there were 16 planes, 5 men per each plane. Of the 80 men that flew, if I remember, something like 70 made it. One crew was shot down and captured over Japan and later executed, but in general, most of the Doolittle flyers actually survived. Each plane dropped 3 bombs on Tokyo, so less than 50 bombs fell when they did this on April 18th, 1942. But it was a massive morale boost for the American people. It showed them that we weren't down and out, that we could strike back. The fact that we hit their capital city, they bombed Pearl Harbor. Yeah, that's bad. We hit their capital. We dropped a few bombs on some factories and railroad yards. We could have easily have put those bombs in the emperor's front lawn. We knew where the imperial palace was. And so we kind of sent a message to them that we weren't done yet. I do want to point out that the American attack by Jimmy Doolittle and friends did convince the Japanese leadership of what their next step should be. Prior to the Doolittle raid, which again was a big boost for Americans and made us feel good, but for the Japanese, they had been arguing for quite some time whether they should first drive south and try and knock Australia out of the war. Australia was basically getting supplies from the United States over here, and that's what was keeping Australia in the fight. The Japanese, some in the Japanese command, especially in the Japanese army, were arguing for a conquest in this direction, right? Where they would then be able to, take, and drive Australia out of the war by basically conquering the islands in this direction, and then they would be able to intercept any supply convoys coming from the United States. Meanwhile, members of the Japanese Navy, like Admiral Yamamoto, were convinced we've got to destroy the American fleet. We did not destroy everything at Pearl Harbor. We did well, but we have some to finish. And obviously the Doolittle raid proves that. Yamamoto wanted to go attack the last American base west of Hawaii, Midway. He figured a Japanese attack and invasion of Midway, America would have to come defend Midway because it was our last stop before Hawaii. And then he could get the outnumbered American fleet in the open water and destroy them there. They'd been arguing back and forth over what to do. The Doolittle raid convinced the Japanese command, let's do both. They felt like they had the numbers necessary, they felt like they had the momentum, and they felt like they could afford to kind of do this 1-2 punch. And so the plan was to send a handful of aircraft carriers down south to capture New Guinea and start cutting off Australia from the rest of the world. The rest of the Japanese fleet would sail to Midway shortly afterwards and try and destroy the American fleet there. Now, one thing the Japanese did not know, we knew something was up. We were capable of reading some of the Japanese radio traffic. We had broken some of their codes. That doesn't mean that we were reading it word for word, but we were able to get enough words out of each message that we were able to piece together a general strategy for the Japanese. So off the bits and pieces that we could read of Japanese signals, we knew something was up. And again, the Japanese had been planning to attack southwards to Australia even before the attack by Jimmy Doolittle. So even before the Doolittle raid, the Japanese had been cooking up the plan to attack southward towards New Guinea and invade. And we were able to kind of piece that together. It became very clear to us in April that they were going to be making a move in that direction. And so we sent American aircraft carriers down towards the South Pacific to try and stop them. We were only able to send a couple of our aircraft carriers, the Yorktown and the Lexington. There in early May, the U.S. fleet and the Japanese fleet engaged each other, although not exactly. The Battle of Coral Sea, and this is an example of a significant aspect to this battle. This is one detail that we are going to look at. the fleets never saw each other. Neither side's ships ever got within 100 miles of each other. The entire battle was fought by aircraft from each other's fleets. Aircraft carrier airplanes fought the entire battle. You know, the Americans launched a strike, the Japanese launched a strike, back and forth. And in some ways, this battle showed you what the future was going to be like for naval warfare in the Pacific. A battleship is no doubt a very impressive vessel. But an aircraft carrier can reach out and hit targets many, many miles further than a battleship's guns can. You know, a battleship can destroy anything it comes into contact with, but it's got to get there first, which means it has to get through a swarm of enemy aircraft. So at the Battle of Coral Sea, all of the fighting was done by pilots from both sides flying long-range missions at each other. In this battle, it was basically a tie, if you're curious. The USS Lexington was sunk. The aircraft carrier USS Yorktown was heavily damaged but survived. The Japanese thought they had destroyed it, but it actually survived by a miracle. The Japanese, one of their carriers was badly damaged and one of their smaller carriers was sunk. So the battle was basically a tie if you count the numbers. Strategically, it was a win for the U.S. because it forced the Japanese to abandon their invasion of New Guinea. We had actually forced the Japanese fleet to retreat a little bit, so that was a bit of a win for us. So the first punch of the Japanese kind of 1-2 strategy sort of got blunted, right? They sort of got stopped and forced to retreat. We'll come back to this part of the Pacific a little bit later, but now let's look at that second strike, the drive to Midway, a small couple of islands in the heart of the Central Pacific. Now, we knew that they were planning to go to Midway. We can read their codes, and this is what the two islands that make up Midway Atoll are, and they are just specks in the vast Pacific. This airfield was really why it was all valuable, because obviously you could put all sorts of patrol airplanes and long-range aircraft and bombers and everything on here, and that's what the Japanese wanted to take control of, because if they could take control of Midway and take control of that airfield, they basically could guarantee the Americans could never again sneak up on the Japanese islands, because the Japanese would be able to patrol this whole area, right, all around it. Now, I'm going to erase some of this stuff so I can explain what the Japanese plan was. Now, the Japanese did not just plan to attack Midway Island. They were fully intending to attack Midway, but as part of their plan to attack Midway, they were planning to actually first launch an attack, a small attack, against the American bases up here in the Aleutian Islands, and launch a small invasion of a couple of small islands here in the Aleutians, which is that chain of islands that actually runs all the way up to Alaska. So the first step was going to be to launch a small attack up here. They were planning that the Americans would go, oh my goodness, the Japanese are attacking Alaska, we've got to go stop them. The Americans would race up towards Alaska. While America was off running up towards Alaska, the actual main Japanese attack at Midway would occur. The Japanese would successfully take Midway, and now the American fleet would find herself trapped. Japanese to the north, and Japanese between them and their bases in Hawaii. The American fleet would then be trapped in a battle where they would be horribly outnumbered, they would be destroyed, and Yamamoto would have his great victory. And the idea was at this point, America would probably have to sue for peace, because our battleship fleet had been crippled, our aircraft carriers would be destroyed, it would be starting from scratch. But we knew what the Japanese were up to because of the codes. We knew that this was a fake. We knew that we could ignore this. We also knew the Japanese were planning to go to Midway. And so instead of the American fleet racing up there, and the American fleet being somewhere around here when the Japanese attacked Midway, the American fleet was waiting right here, quietly waiting to ambush the Japanese. We were in a totally different direction than they expected. The Japanese did attack the island of Midway. They did bomb it. They never got a chance to invade it, though, because the American and Japanese fleets began trading punches shortly after the attack on Midway. Midway is a battle that has been studied over and over and over again. America should have lost. Yes, we had read their codes. Yes, we had laid an ambush. But here you go. At the Battle of Midway, the United States had no battleships. We had 3 aircraft carriers, including a badly damaged Yorktown that was not at full strength when it went to the Battle of Midway. So we have 3 aircraft carriers, 8 cruisers, 16 destroyers. We had aircraft based on Midway, but that was our fleet. 3 carriers, 8 cruisers, 16 destroyers. Facing them, the Japanese gentlemen had 4 carriers, 2 light carriers, 7 battleships, 14 cruisers, 42 destroyers. We were horribly outnumbered. We were outnumbered in ships. In aircraft, it was relatively equal because we had planes on Midway. But America should have been annihilated in this battle. What happened was, and the reason why the Battle of Midway is studied over and over again, and they recently made a movie about Midway, and I do recommend you go see it if you are interested. Here you go. Here's those islands that the Japanese attacked in the illusions to try and distract us. If you do get a chance, they recently made a movie called Midway. It actually was well reviewed by the Office of Naval History from the United States Navy. The U.S. Navy's actual historian praised it for being the most historically accurate portrayal of the battle thus far, done by Hollywood. Not saying it's perfect, but it's pretty good. If you ever read up on the Battle of Midway, the Japanese kept wiffle-waffling. They kept going back and forth. They attacked Midway, and their planes were getting ready for a second attack, but then a scout plane discovered the American carriers, and they were like rearmed with bombs, and then somebody was like, no, let's stick with it. And they kept kind of hemming and hawing, and no one made a firm decision. And fortunately for America, that gave us time, because we discovered the Japanese fleet. We knew where they were. We sent attack after attack. The first few attacks were slaughtered. They went in without fighter protection, and these slow-moving bombers were destroyed. Actually, it wasn't these. These are dive bombers. Our torpedo bombers got destroyed. But in the enemy attacking our torpedo bombers, it took the fighter protection away from the Japanese carriers and left them exposed. And in a matter of a few minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were destroyed. The 4th Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, survived that initial attack and was able to launch a counterattack. This counterattack badly damaged the Yorktown, which would eventually be lost. So Yorktown survived the Battle of Coral Sea, only to be destroyed at the Battle of Midway. But shortly after that, Hiryu would be destroyed. And so the Japanese lost 4 of their aircraft carriers at the Battle of Midway. They obviously had to give up the invasion and retreat, because now there were no Japanese aircraft carriers to protect the Japanese fleet that was now facing 2 American aircraft carriers. The USS Enterprise and USS Hornet were still in the fight. Yorktown was out, but 2 American carriers were still there. And the Japanese had to turn tail and run. Midway is the turning point of the war in the Pacific. I have up there why. Simple. The Japanese are now on the defensive. From the Battle of Midway on, basically the Americans are knocking at the door and slowly driving the Japanese back, time and time again. That's not to say there aren't Japanese counterattacks or Japanese attacks, but the Japanese, their expansion comes to an end at the Battle of Midway. Basically, the high point for the Japanese in the war is here, June of 1942, and that is when Midway took place. It took place June 4th. Of 1942, almost 6 months to the day of Pearl Harbor, which interestingly is exactly what Admiral Yamamoto predicted they had. All of his commanders, of course, they thought they had this one in the bag when they attacked Pearl Harbor, but he warned America was a sleeping giant, and when you wake the giant, he will come back, and he predicted that they had 6 months before America would be ready with a firm counterattack. So he basically kind of said, we have 6 months to win this war. He was really good, because 6 months after Pearl Harbor, we basically drove their fleet into retreat. Not only did we sink their ships, One thing we will see later on in the war, even though the Japanese are able to build replacement ships and replacement planes, it's the experienced veteran crewmen. Some of the pilots who were lost at the Battle of Midway by the Japanese were men who had attacked Manchuria and China in the 1930s. They are men who had been part of the attacks in the Philippines. You had men who had hundreds of hours of combat experience who were lost. And that's the kind of thing that no matter how many kids you put through basic pilot training, you can't get back. But Midway is the turning point of the war in the Pacific. Now, let's go ahead and jump over to Europe. We've done the first 6 months or so of the Pacific War, and we'll come back to it. But let's jump over to what was going on in Europe. When we last talked about Europe, none of this had really happened. We briefly touched upon it. But as we all talked about, the Germans had gone Anschluss, Czechoslovakia, they'd invaded Poland with the help of the Russians. All these people had turned into their allies. They had invaded France, conquered it, forced the South to turn Vichy or collaborate. We had talked about the invasion of Russia briefly when we talked about Lend-Lease. We're going to talk more about that here in a moment. But this is the situation in Europe when the United States entered the war. When Germany declared war on the United States of America, this is the map of Europe, basically. The Germans are either in absolute control of these territories, or they have forced these people to become German allies. Okay? All of this is either a colony of Italy, colonies of France. Spain and Turkey and Sweden are neutral, and that's in Switzerland. But otherwise, pretty much everybody else is under the thumb of the Nazis. Now, that invasion of Russia, Operation Barbarossa, which is named after a medieval German king who died in the Third Crusade, actually. That was one of the largest invasions in history. It was a dramatic blitzkrieg, and it was basically a three-pronged attack. Yes, another three-pronged attack for you guys. Basically, one prong was aimed at capturing Moscow, the capital. One prong went north to try and capture the major city of Leningrad, formerly St. Petersburg. And a third prong drove south, which was really eyeballing eventually taking out the oil-rich area of the Soviet Union. But basically 3 prongs. As you can see up there, very successful early on in gobbling up territory. The German army had, oh no, I did not want that, I wanted that. The German army got to the gates of Moscow, to be quite honest, when winter set in and stopped the German army in her tracks. It was a horrific winter, one of the worst in, I believe, a half a century. Leningrad was basically surrounded and besieged for the next 3 years. The Russians lost tens of thousands of square miles of territory. They took millions of casualties, many of them captured. Millions of Russians were captured in these first few months because the blitzkrieg was so effective. And so the Russians are hanging on by their fingernails, and they are begging for a second front. By that, they were begging the United States and the British to somehow attack the Germans and take the pressure off. To attack the Germans somewhere and force them to pull troops away, because basically the entire German army is invading the Soviet Union. We are nowhere near ready for an invasion of Europe. I know some people were like, oh, let's just hit the beaches of France and let's do this thing. That's Germany's backyard. A rookie American military is in no shape for that. Winston Churchill actually suggested instead attack what he called the periphery, the edges, some of the weaker spots. North Africa looked like a good choice. There were German troops in North Africa, but it was a lightly defended region. It looked like a good spot for the Americans to get some experience. Those French territories of North Africa were lightly defended by Vichy soldiers. It probably wouldn't be that hard for the American military to successfully drive the French out of here and start to take control. Also, it would really help the British. You can see down here, it's hard because of the colors of this map. But if you look down here, the German army was driving into Egypt and was threatening to take out the Suez Canal. which was a vital connection point between Britain and her colonies in India and the Pacific. The idea was if the Americans successfully attacked here, it would put pressure on the Germans, who would now be facing both the British and the Americans from two directions, and we could slowly squeeze the Nazis out of North Africa. So that was the theory behind going and attacking North Africa, and obviously getting vital experience for the American military. The American military did invade North Africa. We attacked Morocco and Algeria. It was codenamed Operation Torch. You don't have to know that, but just if you're curious. The Americans were moving, and we were looking good. And then we ran into the German general in North Africa, a guy by the name of Erwin Rommel. Erwin Rommel had the nickname the Desert Fox. Erwin Rommel found ways to win battles. He was usually outnumbered and outgunned, but he was a master tactician, brilliant at strategy, and he consistently was able to escape traps by the British. He had been forced to retreat after a battle in Egypt, but his army was still the real deal and was a threat. The American forces invading North Africa were led by General George Patton, and then the Americans began pushing eastward. They captured Oran, Casablanca, and they began moving eastward, taking Algiers, and they began driving towards Tunisia. General Patton was not at the front of this attack yet. He was still back here kind of cleaning up the mess. The Americans, though, had it pretty easy conquering North Africa, and they thought no problem. At a place called Kasserine Pass, which is a small mountain pass in North Tunisia, the American army ran into a trap laid by General Erwin Rommel. And in America's first battle versus the Germans, we were humiliated. 7,000 casualties, many of them captured. 200 tanks were lost. The Germans took very few casualties. The American general in charge was quickly replaced by General Patton, who took a very different strategy and approach. General Patton was much like Ulysses Grant, if you remember him. Grant was unafraid of casualties. Grant was very much offensive-minded. Same thing with General Patton. He didn't care what Erwin Rommel's nickname was. He didn't care how many battles Erwin Rommel had won. People compared Erwin Rommel to Robert E. Lee. And, he took a stance like General Grant took against Robert E. Lee. Just attack the man. He's outnumbered, he's outgunned. It's just a question of time. And eventually the Americans would be successful. On May 13th, 1943, the last Germans in North Africa were forced to surrender. The rest had evacuated to Italy, and we will pick up on that story a little bit later. But General Patton, with his British allies coming from Egypt and Libya, were able to basically force the Germans to flee out of North Africa by early 1943. Before we get into the conquest of Italy and such, and also look at what happened over here, there is going to be yet another war between supply ships and U-boats. The famed Battle of the Atlantic, a phrase that was supposedly coined by Winston Churchill. It's obviously going to be a fight to see who gets more ships through. Who is able to are the Allies going to be able to get enough supply ships through the U-boat blockade, or are German submarines going to be able to sink enough to starve the British? The British need oil and fuel from the United States. They're going to need food from the United States. Anything actually coming to the war in Europe is going to have to get through U-boats. And they were quite a threat. Early on, U-boats wreaked havoc. U-boats parked off the coast of the United States of America, actually. One very bold and brave German submarine captain early in the war, he sailed into New York Harbor, and he took a picture of the Statue of Liberty through his periscope, just to prove that that's how close U-boats could get to the coast of the United States. That's how ill-prepared we were to fight the U-boat threat. There were U-boats in the Gulf of Mexico. They were just parked off the coast of Texas, waiting to sink tanker ships as they left the oil fields of Texas. They were having a field day. In August of 1942, or by August of 1942, German U-boat submarines had sunk 360 American ships along our coastline. Some of them had been sunk so close to the coastline that people on the shore could see the fires off in the horizon of the ships that had been hit by torpedoes. We actually built a massive oil pipeline running from Texas to Pennsylvania so we could try and give ships a shortcut so they wouldn't have to go through the submarines of the Gulf of Mexico to get into the open Atlantic. We did have the convoy system in place. There's actually a new movie coming out starring Tom Hanks called Greyhound that is going to be about convoys and U-boats and stuff. I haven't read enough about it, but if you're curious, there's a new movie coming out with Tom Hanks about U-boats. We did have convoys like World War I. U-boats were better than they had been in World War I. For a brief time, the submarines had an advantage. Torpedoes were better. The submarines were better. There were more of the submarines than we had faced in World War I. But the best time for the U-boats was the spring of 42. In the spring of 1942 is when the U-boats sunk the most they would ever sink. They sunk 1.2 million tons of shipping. In May and June of 1942, in those 2 months alone, 1.6 million tons of Allied shipping had been sunk. During that same time period, though, we built 1.1 million tons. So even though the U-boats were making record sinkings during that time period, they barely kept ahead of our productivity. If you remember that discussion that we had the other day about Liberty ships, we averaged 3 Liberty ships produced every day. So you start doing the math. If the U-boats only sink 2 Liberty ships today, tomorrow they have to sink 4 or they keep falling behind, right? Every day they don't sink 3 American supply ships, the Americans get an advantage. They get ahead of the U-boats. And so that was the problem for the U-boats. They were doing spectacularly well at this point. But from then on, it's going to shift in our favor. Why? Technology. As we jokingly sometimes, STEM, radar, better radar that can detect a periscope. Something as small as a thin piece of pipe sticking out of the water can be detected. So now we know when a U-boat's hunting us. Sonar, which is basically radar underwater. It's still using sonic waves, but it's just broadcasting them through the water. That allows us to better detect U-boats and prevent their attacks. Better anti-submarine weapons, better depth charges. All sorts of things are going to pass into the hands of the Allies. So as I said, better depth charges and sonar and radar, etc. All of these weapons give the surface ships an advantage over the U-boats and will turn the tide of battle in favor of the Allies in the Battle of the Atlantic. One more battle that we will talk about, or one more aspect we'll talk about, the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front tends to get overlooked in history books here in our country for a few reasons. One, I would argue, we are reluctant to admit that the defeat of Nazi Germany is more the credit of the Russians than ourselves. Japan, we did that. We definitely won the war against the Japanese. That was basically an American effort with a few British and Australians thrown in. But basically, we defeated the Japanese. The Russians beat the Nazis. Yes, we helped. Yes, we did our part. But we didn't have to be there, honestly. Eventually, for example, when we get there, I'm jumping ahead a little, but on D-Day, if I remember my statistic, 88% of the German army was fighting on the Eastern Front, fighting the Russians. The Russians were, and at that time, were driving them backwards. So basically 90% of the German army was in the East on the day we attacked France, which helps explain why D-Day worked. We were only facing a small fraction of the German army. Most of it was desperately fighting a losing battle against the Russians. And for those of you who are like, why don't we want to give the Russians the credit? These were the communist Russians under Joseph Stalin, the very same Russians we will eventually fight the Cold War against. And of course, we also knew eventually how the Russians fought that war. And it's sort of embarrassing to admit that we were on the same team. Because for every atrocity the Nazis committed, the Russians are kind of guilty of many of the same things. But anyhow, back to the matter at hand. The Germans, who had tried to knock the Russians out of the war in 1941, they'd failed. Remember, old man Russian winter showed up, and the Russians were able to barely hold on to their country, right? They stopped them thanks to winter. The Germans were actually forced to retreat a little bit, but even when the year ended, when 1941 ended, the Russians and the Germans were something like along that line. At the start of 1942, the Nazis had decided a new plan. They weren't as fixated on taking Moscow. They realized capturing Moscow wasn't going to guarantee them winning the war. Instead, they wanted to drive this way. Why? Simple. 3 little letters, oil. This is the oil basket of Russia. Much like how Texas was once the heart and soul of America's oil industry, this is where the Soviet Union got her oil. This area is called the Caucasus region because the Caucasus Mountains are there. This is home to the vast bulk of Russian oil. And so Adolf Hitler had decided taking Moscow was not as important as taking that oil. If he took that oil, 2 things. 1, he could use it. Secondly, without that oil, the Russian economy would collapse and they would have to surrender. And so in 1942, his new plan was to focus his army on, instead of driving to Moscow, driving into the Russian oil fields. And they began doing that very successfully. Now, just off to the side is the city of Stalingrad. Today it's called Volgograd, if you look for it on a map. But the city of Stalingrad was a large city, it served as a gateway to this region, so to speak, right? It was like the last major city before you got into this part of the Soviet Union. And so while most of the German army was driving towards the oil fields, some of it took a left-hand turn to take out Stalingrad. There are 2 reasons for this. 1, the name. Yep. It's named after Joseph Stalin. And Adolf Hitler really wanted to take Joseph Stalin's city. It would be a great embarrassment to Joseph Stalin to lose the city that he had renamed after himself. Secondly, there was an actual strategic purpose. If you take Stalingrad, you can trap or stop any traffic along the Volga River, as you can see here. You take that, you basically cut this river off to the Soviets. They can no longer use it to funnel reinforcements and supplies to this area. You stop anything being shipped along it. Also, railroads and such run to the city. If you take it, you again cut off all of that. I mean, there were strategic reasons. Don't just think it was about pride. It became one of the most brutal fights in all of human history. Eventually, the Germans did take the city. I put city in quotes because it was rubble. It had been carpet bombed into basically oblivion. These 2 armies were fighting over the remains of what had once been a major city. The fighting was brutal. It was house to house, room to room. Quite literally, there were some cases where the Germans were able to take the ground floor. The Russians had retreated upstairs to the 2nd floor, and the 2 forces were trying to shoot each other through the floor/ceiling. They were cutting holes in the floor to drop grenades into the rooms below them. I mean, this was some of the most brutal and horrific fighting you could imagine. People were living in the sewers. There were refugees everywhere. It was horrific. The Germans, like I said, eventually captured the city, or almost all of the city. They took the vast majority of it, except for a little stretch along the shoreline of the river. And then the Russians launched a counterattack. And the Russian counterattack was not designed to retake the city. And I realize it might be hard to see because of the way this map is done, depending on the angle you're looking at it. Instead of counterattacking by trying to drive the Russians out of the city, instead, they counterattacked and trapped the Germans in the city. They focused all of their manpower over here on the sides and trapped all of these German soldiers in Stalingrad. And they slowly but surely squeezed that pocket, denied the men ability to escape, ability to get food, medicine, water, anything. It became an awful experience. 250,000 German troops were trapped in Stalingrad. Only 91,000 surrendered in February of 1943. 160,000 men died in this pocket, as it's called. Of those 91,000, only 5,000 ever made it back to Germany. And those who did make it back only made it back years after the war ended. They were held in Soviet prison camps many years after World War II ended. Many of them died of starvation, disease, abuse, overwork. They were used as slave laborers, etc. Stalingrad is the turning point of the war for the Russians. after Stal, or I should say for the Germans, after Stalingrad, it is a matter of time. The Russians are going to basically go on the offensive, and they will never look back. The Germans will desperately fight battles like the Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943 to try and turn the tables, but after the defeat at Stalingrad, they were never able to recover. They were not able to starve the Russians of oil. The Russians were able to keep the oil flowing. The Russians, by this point, had rebuilt their military. Factories that they had had to evacuate from the initial German invasion were now producing tanks and airplanes. America is full bore in the war. And from basically the spring of 1943 on, the Germans are destined to lose this war. So Midway was the turning point in the Pacific. Stalingrad was the turning point in the war in Europe. In our next video, we are actually going to look at how World War II affected life here in the United States. We'll take a little bit of a break from the actual fighting and the battles. We'll look at the home front. And then after that, we will pick back up where we left off in the Pacific and Europe.